I just read a news headline about how Trump wants to create 30,000 more ICE detention beds by converting Guantanamo Bay into a detention facility. And that brings up a question that a lot of people have been asking me. What actually happens after you get detained by ICE? And so that's what we're going to be generally discussing here today. There are two main scenarios we want to discuss. Number one, if you already have a removal order, what happens? And number two, if you don't have a removal order, what can happen? So once you already have a removal order and it's a final removal order, meaning there's no appeal pending, you've probably exhausted all of your judicial remedies available to you, and you've failed at every step of the way, ICE can detain you. And when they detain you, your options are severely limited. So once they detain you, they are generally trying to obtain a travel document to effect your removal from the United States. And that removal usually takes the form of a repatriation flight. ICE literally has their own airplanes. It's called ICE Air. I'm not kidding, that's actually a real thing. It says ICE on the airplanes. And they are gonna try to fill up that flight and remove you to your home country. Now, there have been some snags with this. Recently, the president of Colombia tried to say, like, we don't want those deportees back. And then Trump strong-armed him and threatened to basically destroy Colombia's economy if they didn't accept those immigrants back. And they quickly decided, you know what, this isn't worth it. We're gonna accept those immigrants back into our home country. And then subsequently, the president of Colombia even put out some sort of like tweet or announcement encouraging people from Colombia who are unlawfully present in the US to voluntarily depart and go back to Colombia. So that worked, but it was interesting, and it really explains what can happen in some scenarios. So a good example is Cuba. So I've defended Cubans before who were not eligible for any defense from deportation, and it was super interesting. In fact, I used to work with a nonprofit organization, and we were doing detained deportation defense. So I was in a prison setting defending this Cuban guy who was being removed from the US. He had mental illness. It was a complicated and really sad scenario, but basically he wasn't eligible for any defense from deportation. And I quickly realized that ICE can't physically deport him to Cuba because there were no diplomatic relations with Cuba. And the reason why they physically couldn't deport them was because Cubans weren't able to get a travel document. So interestingly, the best thing to do for this guy, the outcome that resulted in the least amount of time in detention, was to just accept the deportation order. ICE will detain him for 90 days. They'll try to get a travel document. And when they fail, they usually release him subject to an order of supervision, which basically allows him to live in the US without any immigration status and with a deportation order for the rest of his life, or until there's some sort of major policy shift that allows ICE to deport Cubans back to Cuba. Now, what happens if you don't have a removal order and you don't have a criminal history like that example I just gave? Generally speaking, if ICE is intent on detaining you, they're going to detain you. There's almost nothing you could say to reduce the chances of them detaining you in that scenario. But the more you say, in my opinion, the higher the chances that you're going to end up getting detained, with some caveats. So let's say they detain you. There's one of two ways this will play out in the short term. Either they're just trying to process you and give you a notice to appear and ensure that you're going to come back to court. That could be through a program called Alternatives to Detention. They might put a GPS ankle bracelet on you, or they might just release you on your own recognizance if you weren't one of their priorities and you have strong family ties to the area and no criminal history, and they don't think you're a flight risk and they don't think you're going to commit crimes. They might just release you. And then at that point, you find an immigration attorney who can represent you in the non-detained immigration court setting, where you go before an immigration judge. Things tend to happen slower in the non-detained setting. So you might have some defenses available. You'll pursue those with your immigration lawyer, and hopefully you'll be successful. But what happens if you're not eligible to be released? If the ICE officer determines that they're going to keep you detained? There's a couple things. First of all, are you subject to expedited removal? If you've been in the US for less than 2 years, they can try to expeditiously remove you without allowing you to see an immigration judge. One of the only ways you could stop that process is by invoking a credible fear interview, by saying something like, I'm afraid of returning to Guatemala because of my political opinion. If I go back, I'll be killed. Like, if that's true and you say those words, the next thing that should happen is the ICE officer is supposed to stop your removal from the US and schedule for a credible fear interview. And a different officer, usually with USCIS, will interview you and determine whether you have a credible fear of removal from the United States. If they determine that you don't have a credible fear, then you have a right to have a judge rehear that hearing, and then you can exercise that right for a judge to see if you have a credible fear. If the USCIS officer determines that you do have a credible fear, that'll usually also trigger a notice to appear in immigration court, and now you'll be placed into full removal proceedings before an immigration judge where you could apply for defenses that might be available to you. However, even if you qualify for a full removal hearing before an immigration judge, you might be detained during that process. And if ICE won't allow you out, either on your own recognizance or after paying a bond, you can ask an immigration judge to redetermine your custody determination. So the immigration judge, and I've discussed this in another video recently at length, but I'll just repeat it here. The immigration judge will consider two things when deciding whether to set a bond for you to pay to be released. The purpose of a bond is to somewhat ensure that you're going to return back to court. It's supposed to be some sort of incentive for you to come back to court and not to just like run and disappear into the interior of the United States. The two things the judge will consider is one, whether you're a flight risk. What are your ties to the community? If you have a child who's in preschool and a spouse and an elderly parent and all these family members live in your town or in your house and they're here lawfully, you have ties to the community. You're less likely to just pick everything up, change jobs, and leave and disappear into the United States. Number two, the judge will consider whether you have a criminal history, specifically whether you are a danger to the community. If you have a criminal history, the judge might just deny bond altogether, or might set a really, really high bond that the judge doesn't think you'll be able to pay because they don't want you to be released. If you get released, and then you commit some sort of crime, that's gonna be on that judge who released you, and they don't want that to happen. So if you have a criminal history and you have very loose ties to the community, there's a good chance that you'll either have to pay a really high bond or that you'll be denied bond altogether and you'll have to fight your entire case from detention. Fighting a case from detention is oftentimes enough to make some immigrants just say, screw this, I would rather sign my voluntary deportation than to be held in a jail. And the thing that I'm gonna bring this back to, the Guantanamo Bay cells are particularly relevant here because when you are detained, immigration can move you to any detention facility in the United States. Now, the government currently is saying like this Guantanamo Bay is gonna be for like the worst of the worst offenders. We'll see how that turns into a slippery slope. When Trump was on the campaign trail, he said only criminals, these murderers and rapists are going to get deported. And that has quickly turned into every immigrant is a criminal because they're unlawfully present in the United States. So we want to deport all of them. So we'll see what happens with this. We'll see whether or not there are legal challenges that even allow Guantanamo Bay to be used to house civil detainees who are going through the immigration process. But the bad news is that even if Guantanamo Bay doesn't become an option for detention beds, you might be detained in New York and then get housed in a detention facility in Louisiana, where you would have to access your attorney by video, which is a nightmare, by the way. You'll have to access the immigration courts by video, which in my opinion makes the judges more likely to order you deported because they can make less of a it's less of a personal experience. They don't physically see you. It's easier to order someone deported through a camera screen than it is when you see them right in front of you suffering and you can feel what they feel. Anyway, guys, The purpose of this video wasn't to scare people, it's to answer a question I've been receiving a lot of. If I'm detained, where can my family members find me? There is a website. If you Google ICE Detainee Locator, and I'll put the link in the video description below, you can use this link to find where your loved one is being detained by ICE. You need some information to identify them. Generally speaking, it takes at least 24 hours after someone's been detained for their information to appear in this system. Hopefully this system won't be gutted or stop being used by the Trump administration. It's an important tool for attorneys and family members who are trying to locate their family members, especially if those family members qualify for certain defenses from deportation and might have viable pathways to live legally in the United States. All right, guys, that brings us to the end of today's video. If you're interested in more Trump-related immigration news or just run-of-the-mill family-based immigration or naturalization, that's what I focus my practice on. If you need any assistance with any legal matter, schedule a consultation with me. My information is in the video description below. And otherwise, I'll see you guys next time for another video.